I'd like to invite now our next speaker, who has been an inspiration to me personally. And whatever I'm able to conduct now in the ministry, I owe to him, because he gave me the inspiration and he also gave me the autonomy to be able to develop this. So I invite His Grace Srila Prabhu to join us today for this last session, the concluding session of VIPLAVAH 2021. Last year we had the good fortune of having everybody's physical association. Now it's virtual. And I'm most grateful to Srila Prabhu. He's recovering from a health crisis, but he still obliged us to come and speak to us on a very, very beautiful topic, the rite of passage. So I invite Srila Prabhu to please lead us through that presentation.
Thank you very much, Tapan Mishra Prabhu. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm also technology challenged, as we experienced a little bit with Tapan Mishra Prabhu's presentation. But I assume you can hear me, so I'll go forward.
Prabhu, it's absolutely clear. Your voice is very clear, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tapan Mishra Prabhu and Balamardan and all the devotees that work so hard to put on this conference. It's a tremendous opportunity to come together and hear devotees inspired by Prabhupada's message to enrich the lives of all the devotees of ISKCON through reading Srila Prabhupada's books and doing different teaching programs with Srila Prabhupada's books. Today, I thought I'd take advantage of my position as the last speaker to just offer some reflective thoughts about the state of ISKCON today and how the Ministry of Education, through its various programs, can be a tremendous asset for leading ISKCON from this point forward. I think we're all familiar with the analogy of Srila Prabhupada built a house that the whole world can live in. And indeed, the house of bhakti that he created is certainly capable of housing Vaishnavas from around the world. But of late, I've noticed the appearance of regionalism or other ways in which the ISKCON society is becoming stratified. And it impels me to take a look at the needs created. I just want to share my screen with you and go over some of the things which I think can be responses. Rites of passage, illustrated by Krishna Lila and Krishna's Gurukula Lila. I think that there's a great need to approach this problem of becoming regionalized or stratified by age, for instance, older devotees versus younger devotees. Anything that can divide us, I think, needs to be carefully dealt with by establishing a culture of common practices, common goals, aspirations, not only within ISKCON, but certainly that specifically, but in terms of all the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, different communities of devotees around the world, different yatras, families. I think there's a need to sort of unify and create a common culture among all those efforts so that the the displacement or the movement away from one common culture doesn't continue. And I propose that that can best be done. Well, not best be done. I think that's a bit pretentious on myself. But I think one of the things that can be done or should be done are formalizing rites of passage in our ISKCON society. So what is a rite of passage? You see it defined on the screen, but basically it's a way in which our culture, any culture, can be perpetuated. There's always going to be changes in individual people's lives and in lives of the greater society around us. But what grounds us, or any society, and prevents movement from the core principles has to be countered, first of all, recognized, and then countered in such a way that this movement, that movement away from the house that Prabhupada built, doesn't continue. Some idea of the type of challenges I'm speaking about. An individual searching for his identity in Srila Prabhupada's house. Paradoxes that arise from different practices that are adopted in the name of Srila Prabhupada's instructions around the world. Changing dynamics of the society around us. Even, for instance, death. Death has often an effect on society that can be unsettling. And so the purpose of rites of passage are to stabilize the situation. And it does that in many different ways. So why are rites of passage important? I'll give you a personal example with regard to belonging. Rites of passage are ways in which our belonging to an institution, an organization, a family, a group, a yatra, one of the ways that is recognized or rites help is in terms of the sense of belonging. When I worked with the Vrindavan Gurukula many years ago, back in the 90s, one of the things that struck me when the first class that I was associated with graduated was that they were facing an uncertain future. Even though they were young people, just came out of one of our educational institutions, maybe the only educational institution we had at that time. They came out, but they faced this problem that there was no place for them to be integrated into society, into the ISKCON society. There was no service opportunities. There were no teaching opportunities. There were no puja or pujari opportunities for our own graduates to pass on to. And I realized at that point that feelings of abandonment or not belonging could easily arise amongst the devotees that came out of our own educational institutions. So rites of passage, they give us an opportunity to reinforce this idea of belonging to one common culture, one common organization like this. They build the faith and trust that's required for an organization to move forward. Move forward, for instance, and do all the wonderful programs which are being presented in this symposium. So another reason why rites of passage are important is they connect us with our past. And I think about my godbrothers and godsisters, particularly about this. because when we connect with our past, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going back to the six Goswamis and our previous acharyas, but connecting with our own devotees, elders, for instance. Maybe some of you are familiar with Christian church. They have this idea of elders, where senior, experienced people in the congregation are given sort of a position to help train and guide newer devotees. I think we see this, and by the way, I don't want to say none of this is already not is going on in society. It is. For instance, in Chaupati, I know they have a very strong counselor system, which is the same idea of elders being honored, so that the continuity of life flows in such a way that things remain together. So a role for elders, which is another way that some of the older devotees are exiting active involvement with ISKCON, even as they age, is because they feel there's no role for them. So connecting with the past is another reason why this is important. They place us in a sacred space. I, for one, and I agree, I can understand that people may object, but I think that the practice of rituals is very helpful for community development. Vaisheshika Prabhu was talking about community development very eloquently a few minutes ago. Well, here I feel is another way to ensure community development. Here in Alachua, where I live, there are a group of boys that are taken by one of our community members, who himself is an older Gurukula, and who dresses them very nicely in a very pukka way, and they assist in doing the yajna at each of the major festivals. So these young boys are going through a ritualistic ceremony where their dress is important, the time and the place matter, but by doing this, they're going into a sacred space and they're developing bonds, community bonds, which will carry them throughout their lives. So sacred spaces are important for these rites of passage as well. And finally, in this section, making sense of change. Change is something that happens in our lives in many ways without us having any control. But we can take a proactive stance, as is being done by all the educational programs which have been spoken about here. We can take the positive approach and use change that is inevitable in such a way that it can benefit us. And so change rituals help us make sense of the change, and they offer us the opportunity of welcoming a new voice, for instance, welcoming a new voice of the new generation. Sometimes in management, we get kind of stuck and we don't hear people that are very dedicated, senior in themselves, and that they've been in the movement for 30 plus years. But we think, oh, they're young, they're the young generation. We, the older folks, have to make all the decisions. We're not ready for that change of having a new generation come in. So these are various reasons why I think the establishment of ritual rites of passage, and again, these things are being done in various ways. There are 40-some plus samskaras which are done in generally Hindu traditions, and so many of them are being practiced in ISKCON. But I think formalizing and putting sort of a stamp of approval on this type of process, these rituals of passage, will help bind our communities in ways in which we need to take advantage of. So how does it work very quickly? How do rites of passage work? 3 phases, you see them there: separation, transition, incorporation. Separation basically means giving an opportunity or a chance, for instance, to a young person, your son or daughter, to act on their own. Not that everything has to be done for them at a certain point in life. They have to act on their own. And that's recognized through this separation aspect of a rite of passage. Transition means they may go through a personal test or challenge, being on their own for the first time or entering into a new situation. But that's okay. I mean, obviously, as long as it's done in a way that people aren't harmed or injured in any way. But some transition is made. It's a personal challenge. And then there's the reincorporation, or taking back, reintegrating those people who have crossed the passage, met the challenge, and bringing them into society where they can participate with new ideas and new enthusiasm. So these are three phases of rites of passage that I think are also beneficial and could be incorporated officially one way or another by our devotees in ISKCON. There's an example that involves Krishna's Leela of going to the Gurukula. And I just highlighted this so you can understand how these three steps are actually seen in the Lord's Leela. Prabhupada writes in the Krishna book about when Krishna, after killing Kamsa and the political situation being arranged in the king of Mathura, political questions were resolved. Then Krishna was given the Gayatri mantra, and at that point, Vasudeva sent him to Sandipani Muni's ashram. And so Prabhupada says it's customary after being initiated in a Gayatri mantra for one to live away from home for some time under the care of the Acharya. So even Krishna recognizes in his Leela, we can see this idea of how separation actually helps the maturation of the students, young people, from being a child to becoming a contributing member of the society. So separation and transition. I love this story. It tells about how Krishna and Sudama went out and got caught in the dust storm and the rainstorm, and they passed the whole night in that way in service. They met the test by coming together and working together and giving each other shelter. It's interesting to note, if you see any paintings of this Leela, how Krishna is holding on to the wood he gathered throughout the whole stormy night. They did not give up the service of the Guru, even though they were faced with tribulations. They stayed together and held on to the wood so they could present it to their Guru for sacrifice. I thought that's a perfect example of how to meet the transition by being faithful to the Guru in spite of difficulties. And then finally, the final stage, the incorporation. After Krishna and Sudama passed this test, the Guru was very satisfied with them. And he blessed them in ways in which I've highlighted in the PowerPoint here. How they would take part and incorporate the experiences, the growth they had in the society, and not feel abandoned nor fail to take responsibility. When I was dealing with a problem in our community here in Alachua for some time, I was talking with different devotees from the different sections of society. And I was very disheartened after speaking with one young man about the community problem. And he said to me that, well, that's your problem. That's your problem. That's not our problem. That's not my problem. In other words, that's ISKCON's problem, not my problem. I felt very hurt by that because all the times I've been working in this movement, I felt that it's all of us all together. But then I realized there are sections of society who have become alienated some way or another, so that they don't see the society's problems as theirs. Or more importantly, probably, they don't see the skills and abilities that they have as being useful and willingly contributed to ISKCON. So not only do we have to go through changes, rites of passage, we change, we develop, but we also have to be reincorporated and remember and try to do our best to stay giving of our abilities, our talents in the service of Srila Prabhupada and ISKCON. So I think that if we give ourselves the opportunity to remain focused like this by highlighting different rites of passage, and they're going to come from many different places. Some will come obviously from educational programs that all of you are working so hard to contribute. They'll come from brahmachari ashram, grahastha ashram. They'll come from other ministries or activities that are being supported and promulgated by devotees of ISKCON. They'll come from a lot of different places. But if we can recognize them and formalize them in some way, I think it'll help the cohesion of the society. And of course, a lot of that comes from the educational endeavors that all of ISKCON is working to make important. I mean, it's not by mistake or happenstance that education was the first ministry that Srila Prabhupada established. He established it because, if I can dare say, being associated with the ministry for many years, it's the most important of the ministries. And one of its functions is to provide the rites of passage, as I've tried to introduce this morning. I haven't given any specific rites of passage because, as I say, they come from many different areas. But I hope you get the idea from this short presentation about how important formalizing rites of passage are, so our society progressively matures, and as we transit from young person to middle-aged person to old person, and then ultimately on to spiritual activities in another realm. So, Tapan Mishra, I believe that's the sort of the reflective message that I wanted to give today. Thank you for organizing such a wonderful gathering of Vaishnava devotees around the world. And I will stop sharing my screen with that.
Thank you, Prabhu. You mentioned in your presentation one of the key themes of rite of passage is for the elders to share reflections and thoughts with the next generation. That's precisely what you've done. You have now implanted in the ministry a very important thought, a seed about the rite of passage. I must admit, I feel overwhelmed just even thinking about what we may have to do to undertake this. But I seek the blessings, your blessings, and the blessings of the devotees here, that this may come true sooner than later, because it's so important. So, dear devotees, if you have any questions, then please address them now. We do have one hand up by one devotee in Russian. Perhaps somebody can translate that, if it's a question. So on behalf of, yes, I think we have the question. So the question from Srivas Pandit Prabhu: are rites of passage synonymous with samskaras?
Basically, you can understand them like that, yes. And therefore I mentioned the Hindu tradition. I'm sure if we consulted Hari Bhakti Vilas, we could find Vaishnava traditions, and samskaras also, which are equivalent. But we know things like Upanaya, ceremony, which is not, in one sense, practiced in ISKCON the way it's practiced in general Hindu society. But there are many different samskaras, birth, even starting school. There's one where the child is, Prabhupada almost gives it when that picture of him in Dwarkadish where he's taking his hand and making the letters. But that's a samskar. So there are many that, again, have been practiced informally, but I'm advocating that they become formally part of ISKCON's efforts to remain together as a society.
Thank you, Prabhu. And if I may add, the one that comes very, very clearly in my mind is actually the samskar of initiation and the whole process around it, how Srila Prabhupada described it. And in some of the sampradayas, actually, they have a seal, heated up, silver seal, completely with heated up like fire, and then you actually get an impression in the Sri Sampradaya on both your hands of the 4 symbols of Lord Vishnu. But this is what I remember that Srila Prabhupada.
We're not advocating that.
We're definitely not. For us, as we read in our paper, it's these, for the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, we have our impressions in the simple form of our tilaks over the 13 parts of the body.
Very important. We take them as the everyday practices, but accepting these Vaishnava samskaras, Vaishnava markings on body, very important. And those things hold us together, as well as some of the other things I tried indicating.
Yes. Thank you so much, Sesha Prabhu.